Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another edition of On the Mark here at Westfield Community Programming Channel 15 and 89.5 FM WSKB. I'm your host, Mark Auerbach, and today we're going to spend an hour with Peter Weis, who is the archivist at Northfield Mount Hermon School. Now, you may not know what an archivist is, but you're going to learn. And one of the reasons I wanted to ask Peter to join us today was not only because he's one of my close friends from high school days, but because so many of us are downsizing our homes or going through a parent's storage bin and condensing and consolidating things. And the question that always comes up is, how do you preserve and maintain the memorabilia that you have? And I'll give you a very brief anecdote. About 10 years ago, I was selling my father's house, and the real estate agent said, this place needs to be decluttered, and you need to get rid of all the junk and the garbage that you have. And so the realtor explained to my father what decluttering meant, and he said he would have it done by a week. And a week later he said, well, I threw out last year's TV guides and a bunch of old newspapers. And this past summer, as I've been going through my father's storage bin, there are hundreds and hundreds of letters that he saved and all kinds of stuff, photographs of relatives from the old country and things. I had no idea what any of it was. The newspapers were yellowing. I didn't know how to preserve the photos. Unfortunately, boxes of them are in my garage, which is not winterized. But we all come up with this at some point. How do you store the things that mean the most, and how do you discard them, and how do you preserve them? So I thought that having an archivist who does this for a living would be a great guest. And also to introduce Peter. Peter and I did not know each other when we were both in high school, but his father was my math teacher, and I think that was probably his father's ultimate academic challenge of a lifetime. But Peter, it's great to have you here.
It's great to be here, Mark. Thanks for inviting me down.
Yeah. Gosh, we haven't seen each other since before the pandemic and all that good stuff. So what does an archivist do?
Well, the classic definition of an archivist is someone who collects, appraises, arranges, describes, preserves, and makes available the records of enduring value to an institution. That's a long way of saying we put things away in such a way that we can find them again and use them. So materials that are going to sit and never be looked at, why we can discard them. Materials that we might possibly look at in the future, it's much more of an open question about whether we keep them. As the archivist at Northfield Mount Hermon, the most important records that we have, you can have a school without students, without teachers, without buildings, but you can't have a school without students. So in a way, our most important files are the student files from our founding 140 years ago to the present, including yours and mine.
I know yours and mine are in a special place, but how do you, are they just in a storage unit somewhere? How do you keep the elements from aging them?
So the most important thing is climate control, and it takes sort of there are two avenues to explore there. One is temperature, and the other is relative humidity. And too much humidity obviously creates mold. Too little humidity will dry out paper. And temperature, again, if you have high temperature and high humidity, you have mold. Ideal storage conditions can't always be met because you have institutional constraints. You might not be able to keep things as cold as you'd like. Harvard University has climate control for some of their most valuable materials, and they store records below freezing. We're obviously not doing that.
What is considered to be an important record in the eyes of Northfield Mount Hermon, for example, to save? I mean, you can digitalize photographs now and digitalize yearbooks and some of that stuff. But do you still keep, once you digitalize something, is it worth saving the original?
Well, that's a great question, and in fact, doing creating digital copies of materials that are paper or photographs is a way of providing access. So if I take the school newspaper and I digitize it, I can put the digital copies in the cloud, and I can make them available to classes who are thinking about reunions or who want to remember what things were like at their school 50 or even 100 years ago. But it's no substitute for the actual paper. Occasionally, you'll look at a digital copy, and it won't be as the quality just won't be there. There may be stray marks on the paper that give us tips about what the original, what the person was thinking when they created it. So I try to convince the powers that be that creating digital copies is great for access. It's not a substitute for preservation.
Okay. Well, but you also in the archive store more than papers. There are yearbooks, press clippings, and you took me on a tour of the archives once, and they were called dummy smocks. They were the Northfield School for girls before the two schools merged. The women had to wear a smock over their clothes when they did their work jobs, but there were collections of clothing and other artifacts.
Right. So there's clothing. So cloth requires its own set of preservation standards. We have things like class rings and mugs and materials that various alumni have sent back to the school from their travels across the world. In the early days, there were missionaries who were out in the world and who sent back things like southwestern pottery, and we have these things, and figuring out exactly where they fit in with the history of the institution and what sort of story they tell is important and helps us determine whether we're going to keep something long term, and if the item can't be displayed and can't somehow contribute to the ongoing story of our institution, that's when we need to think about whether it's worth keeping.
Do you have any idea? I mean, it's been over 140 years. How many items you actually have archived?
That's a great question. I think that there are, when we think about the student files, I sort of throw around a number of roughly 1 million pieces of paper. It's over 900 cubic feet of records. And if you think about a sort of standard box that measures 16 inches by 12 inches by 10 inches, the kind of box that you would use to move materials if you were moving your house, say, that's 950 boxes full of only student files. And that amounts to something less than half of our paper collection. But that doesn't necessarily include all of the artifacts that we have, the paintings that we have. We have a separate art gallery, and they have their own storage, but there are certain paintings which are viewed more as archival, in that, so paintings, for example, of school administrators, of heads of school, are in the archives. They're not necessarily great works of art, but they speak to our history.
To preserve what you have, can anybody go to the archives, or can only a certain number of people actually go in and handle and move around the memorabilia?
So right now we're in the middle of a pandemic, so the campus is essentially closed. Students can see materials who might be working on a school project that has to do with traditions or customs of the institution over time. we have a women's history course where students might be interested in, say, dress codes over time, and so those materials, which are in the student handbook, that information which is available in the student handbook is available to students to see. But we also make available student files for people whose ancestors have gone to the school. So a record that's recent, an individual has a right to privacy, and the material in a student file is confidential. But once it passes from the date of its creation, once 80 years have gone by, that person is less likely to be alive. And if that person's grandchildren or great-grandchildren are interested, I get a certain amount of correspondence from people who are interested in seeing that material. And we digitize that. And in a non-pandemic situation, an individual could come and visit the archives and could see a file that belonged to one of their ancestors.
So many academic institutions and not-for-profits, cultural institutions, have archivists as part of their staff. Where do you learn to do something like this?
Well, I started off going to grad school at the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. I was in a graduate program in history, and there's a branch of history called public history. And that branch of history called public history has in turn three branches. One, which is historic preservation, which really has to do with maintaining buildings. The second one is museum studies, which has more to do with material items. We call it, in the archives world, we talk about realia or objects. And then the third track is archives. And when I talked to my program director, I said, I'm really interested in archives and paper and how one actually gets to do history. Because in order to do history, you need to be looking at documents. And he said, we don't have the program here in Amherst. You'd have to go to UMass Boston. And I thought, I don't want to do that. But I took the public history class and had one seminar on archives and was hooked. And all of a sudden, Boston didn't seem like a big commute, and I started making a trek down there to take the archives courses. I did that. I finished that program in 1997 and decided that I'd like to get a second degree, so I went and got a Master of Library Science with an archives concentration at SUNY Albany and finished that in 1998. And then I worked in the antiquarian book trade and did some other things and kept my sort of hand in the game and read the things I needed to read. And I got a call one summer day saying that the archives at Northfield Mount Herman needed someone to keep a chair warm for a year while the then archivist took a leave of absence. And 22 years later, I'm still there.
So it's, in a way, you got your dream job.
I did. I like to say that I came to the school in 1962 in the backseat of my father's GMC Suburban when he went to the school to teach mathematics. And I was fortunate enough to go to Northfield Mount Herman. And when the call came to be the archivist there, it really was a dream come true.
Yeah, when you first took me on a tour of the archives, it was on the Northfield campus, which the school ultimately sold. Where do the archives at Northfield Mount Herman live now?
So there are when we moved out of that space at Northfield, we moved the most important records to a space in the on the lower level of the present library, Schaeffler Library, and had to put the bulk of the records in climate-controlled trailers. They've now been moved to a climate-controlled space in the laundry building. So we actually have a much better space in terms of just our ability to access records than we've had since we closed the Northfield campus, and I'm really grateful for that.
Are you a staff of one as the archivist, or do you have help with storing and cataloging and all?
Well, I'm sort of a staff of one. So the school has a work program where every student who attends the school contributes 4 hours or so of labor a week to the community. And I've had students who have helped particularly digitize materials. They have scanned a newspaper, for example. They've scanned yearbooks, and they help put things away. And recently, we've had a woman who is working on her master's in library science at Simmons out of Cambridge, and she has devoting an extra 15 hours a week to the archives. And it's really about putting things away. As I said at the beginning, it's easy to get things out and share them with people, but making sure that that material gets put back in a place is, my father used to say, a job isn't complete until the tools are put away. The tools of the archivist's trade are paper, and making sure that they go back in the right place is important, because most of these materials, it's not like a book where all the pages stay in order. These are loose pieces of paper that need to be put into a particular order in order that they can be found again.
We're talking with Peter Weis, who's the archivist at Northfield Mount Hermon School. And when we come back after this break to acknowledge our underwriters who make programming like this possible, we're going to ask about how you store and preserve some of the memorabilia hanging around your basement, your attic, or your storage compartment, and all that. This program is On the Mark. I'm Mark Auerbach. Peter Coles is our chief engineer today. You're listening to us either on 89.5 FM WSKB, Westfield Community Programming Channel 15, or if you've missed any of this program or any of the previous ones, you'll find them archived at WSKB Community Radio's YouTube page. So don't go away. We'll be right back.
Support for community radio on WSKB is provided by Betts Plumbing and Heating Supply Company, an independent, family-owned wholesaler serving Westfield for over 50 years, specializing in plumbing, heating, and industrial piping supplies. On the web at bettsplumbing.com or at 14 Coleman Avenue in Westfield.
Underwriting for community radio is provided by the YMCA of Greater Westfield. Every day, the YMCA strengthens the community through programs and services focused on youth development, healthy living, and social responsibility. For all the Y's many programs and services, visit us on the web at www.westfieldymca.org. The YMCA, 67 Court Street in downtown Westfield. We're more than a gym. We're a cause.
Hi, this is Harry Rock, host of Rock on Westfield every fourth Wednesday at 8 a.m. Tune in for my view of this place I call home.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB.
Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 and 89.5 FM WSKB Westfield.
Welcome back to On the Mark, everyone. I'm Mark Auerbach. Peter Coles is our chief engineer. My guest this morning is Peter Weis, who's the archivist at Northfield Mount Hermon School. So, Peter, suppose you are cleaning out your attic and you find these old newspapers from way back when. And example, my father saved 10 copies of the Springfield Republican the day that Kennedy was assassinated. Well, some of them seem to be well preserved. Some of them were crumbling. But if you want to save old newspapers and you don't have a lot of climate control, how do you save paper?
Well, newspaper presents particular problems because paper that has a high lignin content, a high cellulose or wood content, is acidic, and it naturally degrades over time. Paper from certain eras, good paper, it's amazing as we look at the materials in the school archives. Certain paper is beautifully preserved. It's got a high rag content, a lot of cloth content, and doesn't break down at all. So the most important thing is to keep the acidic paper away from the non-acidic paper. So if you've got newspapers and you're storing them next to your original copy of the Constitution of the United States, you're making a mistake. So, and with newspaper, actually, one thing, we talk about preservation photocopying. So you can photocopy a newspaper onto a Permalife, an acid-free paper, and preserve it that way. But in certain cases, there's really nothing you can do. It's if the paper is highly acidic. If you look at scrapbooks, say from the 1960s, it was on this brown paper, and it crumbles. And there's really short of having the paper deacidified at a place there's a place called the Northeast Document Conservation Center who can deacidify paper for you, but that's extraordinarily costly, and it wouldn't be worth doing that to your copies of the Springfield Republican.
And actually, I would think, though, I don't know what the value would be of having a newspaper from November 22nd, 1963, when you could find that front page online. I mean, the newspapers have archived their cover pages for years. But you mentioned letters. I found in my father's stuff, during the war, World War II, and afterwards, there were these stationery called aerograms, where you wrote your letter on a piece of paper, which folded and folded and then turned into a letter and an envelope. And you put your postage on it and sent it. And that they seem to preserve much, much longer than letters written on other kinds of stationery.
So that paper is good paper. One of the things that I recommend when people are trying to save things, there are two basic pillars of the archives trade. One of them is provenance, which has to do with who created this document, and the other is original order. So if your father had these files in the attic and he had these boxes of things, and he were careful about how he put things away, you would want to, if you were thinking about this as your father's papers, you would want to, as much as possible, maintain the order that your father had created, and you would want to keep the things that your father created and not sort of stir them in with other materials. If he kept carbon copies of letters that he wrote interfiled with the letters that he received, you'd want to keep things in that order. If he had somehow separated out his carbons from the materials that he had received, you would respect that somewhat different way of arranging materials.
Yeah. What about books? I mean, I know that some people, a friend of mine had said not too long ago, was cleaning out his parents' attic, and his mother had saved his high school textbooks. And he said some of them were actually in good condition. They had been in bookshelves, and others were just crumbling and falling apart. But what about books or scrapbooks? How do you keep those going, and what do you keep and what do you toss?
Well, the question about scrapbooks is a good one, because there are people who give us scrapbooks, and we have them from the late 19th century all the way up through the late 60s. And it's not really something that people do much of anymore. There are a handful of people who are still into scrapbooking, but most of the scrapbooks that we have particularly from the 50s and 60s, are on this really terrible paper, or they've been put together in those magnetic photo album books, which is really it's a gummed backing.
With the plastic that covers the picture.
Right.
Yeah.
And so materials like that we take out of the book, because the book itself is working to degrade the materials in it. and we'll keep the materials. We might photocopy the page before we remove the materials from the page, and then actually remove the materials from each individual page and put them. We might put them in Mylar enclosures to keep the order, but we won't necessarily keep the actual scrapbook if the scrapbook itself is working to degrade the materials that are in it.
And what about photographs? There are boxes of photographs in most people's storage. They fade with time. Does it make sense to scan them and save them to disk or to the cloud or something like that, or is there a way to actually preserve the photos themselves?
Well, one of the most important things. I like to say that people say that a picture is worth 1,000 words. There are times when a word is worth 1,000 pictures if the pictures aren't identified. So if we have snapshots of people, and if it's a picture of somebody that's close enough to the individual that we can't see where they're standing, and we have no idea who that person is because the image was never labeled, that's not worth very much. So we do like to get photo albums where everything is meticulously labeled, and we can find out who a person was and who their friends are, and then it starts to have some real value.
I suppose in 10 years or 15 years, people will have saved their photos to Facebook or to their phone, and the idea of actually printing out a photograph will be something almost on the antique level.
Yeah, I think you're right about that. And one of the things that's interesting, so people take thousands and thousands of photographs with their iPhones, but unless you have what we would call metadata attached to those images, so what date was it taken? Well, that actually your phone will keep that information nicely, and if you have your locations turned on, your GPS turned on your phone, it will tell you where the photograph was taken. But in terms of describing what the actual content of the image is, we aren't there yet. Now, I suppose we've got facial recognition software that will ultimately provide some information like that, but that's the kind of information that's really most important. And when we look at photographs that are in the school archives, knowing when they're taken, wanting to know what the circumstances are important. And then in terms of preserving them, photographs, the emulsion on an image, whether it's an albumin print or a gelatin silver print, and there are sort of many different photographic formats, tin types, etc. We want to make sure that the outgassing, so that those emulsions create gases which are not necessarily hospitable to paper. So if you've got photographs stored with paper, it's really important to make sure that the photographs are in enclosures, and they don't have to be sealed, but just doing something to reduce that outgassing is important.
Yeah. What about older records, like record albums, 33s, 45s, 78? They tend to warp in time. And how do you preserve that? Is it best to take that old album and have it converted to CD or converted to some other form, or is there a way to actually preserve the cover and the record?
So we do both. We keep a certain number of copies of vinyl records, as we used to call them. We digitize them. We don't have. Sometimes we'll send them out. So a class might want to create some digital version of a particular event for a reunion, and we're happy to provide the vinyl discs to classes if they want to have things done professionally in a studio. We have the ability to make copies with all of the pops and we hope not skips, in a vinyl recording, and to make it into tracks. And there are a variety of different digital formats. There are WAV files, and there are MP3s, and there are AIFF files. And actually, I'm not a techno guru of those different formats, but we look for sort of using industry standards for creating.
Yeah,
those
one of my
files.
co-anchors or colleagues here, both on Westfield Community Programming Channel 15 and on 89.5 FM WSKB, converts files like old movies to computerizes them, or slides and things like that. And there is a lot of technology out there to do that. But in some cases, some of these old records, like my high school class graduation year, there were two major concerts. One was a sacred concert that was school-wide, and the other was a Christmas Vespers. And they were always recorded. And I found that, I know that you have the original vinyl for these, but you're able to actually digitize them.
Yes, and we've created those, and then we share those with classes who in turn will create a website and make available the digital versions of these events. And it's really pretty gratifying. I mean, that's one of the things that I think is important, is that we keep the original vinyl, because who knows what's going to happen sort of down the line. How stable are these digital formats? How long is a file going to last in the cloud? We don't know the answer, and until we can be sure, a vinyl disc kept in, as long as we don't heat it up too much, as long as we keep it nice and cool, will last, as far as we know, for longer than any of us are going to be around.
Yeah. What about movies? I mean, people took back, I guess before our time, they were everybody had their home movie cameras, and then they switched. Now, very few people take movies except on their phones. And they make their videos and stuff. What about the old movies and the slides with the carousel projector, where people had millions of slides? What's the best way to save those?
Well, actually, that's another really great question, because if you're not going to maintain the material that's going to allow you to play back whatever it is, whether it's a slide that you need to have that carousel for, or if you're not going to have your 16 millimeter projector so that you can watch your movie, you need to be able to view it somehow. And that goes also even with CDs and DVDs. So most laptop computers, people's computers now, don't have a DVD player in them anymore, because it's all streaming off the internet or out of the cloud.
And most cars don't have a CD player anymore.
Right. So having the ability to play back the materials that you have is important. And so we keep slide carousel projectors around, because certain classes created slideshows for themselves 40 years ago and want to be able to see them. And we'll loan out those materials and say, well, look, if you want to digitize this, be our guest. But know that if you made a class video and recorded it on VHS tape, there's not really a whole lot that we can do for you, because we don't necessarily have a Betamax player to play back that kind of tape.
Yeah, I know so many people have tons of movies on VHS, and basically they go to the dumpster because there's no way to really convert them to anything else easily.
Right. And so we do have a lot of film shot from anywhere from the late 20s through the 1960s. And that film we would love to get transferred. It's not an inexpensive process. And again, there are industry standards which frankly are constantly changing for what constitutes a stable digital format. But the fact that we have this film and that we can view events that took place on the campus 80 or 90 years ago is pretty spectacular.
Yeah, it's incredible. It's such a repository of history that you get to live and work in every day.
I'm really lucky, and there's nothing quite like looking at a film made in 1940 showing boys picking apples and milking cows and then consuming the results in the dining hall at the end of a 10-minute film that was put together as a promotional device for the school.
Well, we're going to take another fast break here to acknowledge the underwriters that make programming like On the Mark and other programs here available on both 89.5 FM WSKB and Westfield Community Programming Channel 15. We're having the great luxury this morning of chatting with Peter Weis, who's the archivist at Northfield Mannerman School. Peter Coles is our chief engineer. I'm Mark Auerbach. And while we take this break, sit back and think about how you want to declutter and save and categorize all the stuff as you might be downsizing or going through family history, especially during this holiday season when somebody may pull out a scrapbook of the family holidays of 1942 or something like that. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
Support for community radio on WSKB provided by Westfield Electroplating. Employing over 140 skilled platers, painters, and technicians, Westfield Electroplating was founded in 1946 and was the first company in the country to achieve National Aerospace and Defense Contractor Program accreditation, proudly maintaining that status for over a decade. Westfield Electroplating provides over 50 quality finishes to meet your corrosion, cosmetic, or performance needs. On the web at www.westfieldplating.com or 413-568-3716. Westfield Electroplating, putting the finishing touches on technology.
Support for the community programming of WSKB is provided by the Barnes & Noble College Bookstore in the Ely Campus Center, offering Westfield State t-shirts, sweatshirts, and gift merchandise, all of your academic needs, and offering textbook materials in new, used, ebook, and rental formats. Available at the bookstore on campus or online at westfieldState.bncollege.com.
This is Ken Stomsky from Ken's Den on WCPC 15 and 89.5 FM, Tuesdays, 8 to 10.
Community Radio.
89.5 WSKB.
Live from Studio 120 at Westfield Technical Academy, this is WCPC Channel 15 and 89.5 FM WSKB Westfield.
Welcome back to On the Mark, everyone. I'm Mark Auerbach. Peter Coles is our chief engineer. We're here with Peter Weis, who's the archivist for Northfield Mannerman School. Peter, we talked about saving books, newspapers, and records and things like that, but what about love letters and old correspondence? One of the things I found in my father's storage unit was letters that his mother had written to his father. They were love letters, and then there was a book that his mother had saved where she had pressed a rose between wax paper. And the rose was quite faded, but there's something about love letters or birth announcements that go way back. How do you save a letter?
Well, the most important information in a letter, or one of the important pieces of information in a letter, is the date that it was written. And often people won't put a date on a letter. I always do, because as an archivist, I'm aware that somebody might care when I wrote this letter. So that includes not just the month and the day, but the year. And the other thing can help with that, though, is a postmark on if the letter were mailed. If it were if it were a love letter and it were hand delivered, that's another matter. But keeping envelopes together with the original letter is important. And generally speaking, if I'm working on a collection at school, and we've been given some wonderful collections of letters that students wrote home to their parents, and that at the death of the parent, they were going through their parents' papers, they discover all these letters that they wrote home when they were a student. And then if those letters get turned over to us in the archives, it's really exciting because it provides a real window into school life. So we'll take the letters out of the envelopes and we'll carefully unfold them, flatten them, and try to keep them in the order that they were in. If they were just thrown into a shoebox and no real attention was paid to what order they were in, we do our best to recreate that order. So sometimes order is going to be an artificial thing, and sometimes it's not. And as I said earlier, you might have somebody who just keeps all of the letters that they ever received in the order in which they received them. And you might have somebody else who carefully sorts things into, this is family and this is friends. And I keep that's how I sort my letters in my files. And I would hope that if anybody decides that my letters are worth keeping, or letters that I've received are worth keeping, that they'll respect the fact that I have files that say former students or current students or grandma or Sarah, and that order is respected, and that they don't simply put them in chronological order, beginning with the first letter that they can find that I ever wrote.
Yeah, my cousins and I are all going through the process because not only did my father die within the last couple of years, but his relatives, my aunt and others. We're seeing these letters written back and forth. A lot of them don't have dates, or family photographs where nobody's identified. So we have to sort of figure out. And so we've got one cousin digitalizing things and passing them along to the other cousins to see if they can identify anybody from their family. And the oldest remaining relative is 100. And she's not, she's got memory issues now, but she can go back if you show her a photograph from 1919 and say, who are these family members? She can get, so we're trying to label certain pictures in the hopes that if we can save them, we can do it. One of the things you do besides archiving and besides being out on the Connecticut River all the time and riding your bike all over the hood is you sat down and wrote a book of poems over the last couple of years. It's been published. It's called Poems Out of School. What made you decide to sit down and write?
Well, I think within many people, I was going to say everyone, but that's probably too broad a generalization, but many people feel that there's a poet in them somewhere. And I started writing poetry when I was a high school student at Northfield Mount Herman and submitted things to the literary magazine, and they were all pretty terrible, and nothing ever got published. But I sort of kept at it, and about 30 years ago, there was a fire at the power plant at the school, which caused me to write a poem about that power plant. And so I've had this interest in writing poems relating to Northfield Mount Herman that's a pretty old impulse. And when I started working at the school, that impulse was revived. And I have to say that COVID has not been very kind to that writing impulse. But over the course of the 20 years that I've worked at the school, I've taken some poetry writing workshops and just continued to write poems about the place where I work, which has really inspired me. And the book is divided up into people, places, and things, so that it really is the place itself that's the inspiration for the poems. I don't set out to write a poem about a certain thing. Generally, things just come to me.
Yeah, you were very kind to give me a copy of the book early on when it came out. And of course, since we both had similar high school experiences at the same high school, certain of the people you talk about and the history of the locations and everything hit home. I mean, it was like I had been there, even though they were written sometimes about people, things, and places long before we were even born. But I just found that it's a unique work of poems because you don't have to have been a part of that to feel some of the history and all that you wrote about. Do you think now that the first book of poetry is out, you're going to go write a second one?
I hope so. I'm still inspired. I'm still writing these poems that the school kind of draws out of me, and I hope that there's a second book there. I hope that I stay healthy, and I hope that I can continue to write. But I don't see any reason why the school would stop inspiring me. It really is a place that's living through me.
And you're so lucky. I mean, you're so lucky to be able to go back. But I've got to say, the inspiration that I have of Northfield Mount Hermon is not just the people that I got to know when I was there, and the alumni are like one big family. But the view of the Connecticut River from high atop the hill in Gill, Massachusetts, that Northfield Mount Hermon overlooks the river. And the fog that rises off the river in the mornings so often was something that astounded me as a teenager, standing there and seeing the fog rise. And as an adult, and of course living down here in where the river is wider in Springfield, we don't get the morning fog like that very often. But when we do, and I go walking down on the river, down by the wildlife refuge in Long Meadow, when the fog comes off, it takes me back to when I was 15 years old or 14 years old. And to me, it was total magic. And the fact that it reminds me that because so many of us live in great, beautiful parts of Western Massachusetts, the world around us just is absolutely stunning if we take the time to think about it.
You should write a poem about that, Mark.
Well, I don't know if maybe someday. I'm not a poetry writer, as you know, Peter. I can barely write an email. And now you've got me guilt-tripped into making sure that I put the date and the year on every email that I subsequently write. Where can people get the book?
The book is available. This is a little self-serving, but it's available through a website called Crowmarsh Press, all one word, and that's the name of the publishing outfit, which is actually just a cover for me. It's my own publishing firm, and in fact, if you have a book that you're interested in publishing, I might be able to help you. I learned about the publishing industry by doing this book, working with Bowker and getting an ISBN, working with the Library of Congress on cataloging and publication data. And it was really a great learning experience and a lot of fun. And so I like doing things. I'm happy to do things on my own. So while it's a truly self-published book, it's not self-published by some third party. It's just my thing.
I mean, I interviewed for Artsbeat a publisher who's also an author and has a publishing house, and she said you just don't know what goes into publishing a book. You just don't write it and take it into somebody, and they go, oh, fine, we'll publish it, and it's all said and done, unless you're very famous or unless you have a real great tell-all, kind of book. But it's quite the process.
And I was really lucky to work with a designer, actually, a woman who I knew when she was a student at Northfield Mount Hermon. She was a graduate in the class of 2007, and she's a designer. And I happened to run into her at a campus event, and I showed her this sort of moribund design that I had just done myself. And she said, I'm a designer. I could really work on this. And so I should be really clear that I certainly had a great deal of help along the way in terms of making it be a real book.
We only have a minute or two left, but today we're taping this to run the day before Thanksgiving. But today is the 55th anniversary of an event that put Northfield Mount Hermon School on the map, because during a football game with Northfield Mount Hermon's rival school, Deerfield Academy, during the halftime, the science building at Northfield Mount Hermon on the Mount Hermon campus burnt down. Photographs were taken of it, and photographs, I don't know how it got distributed worldwide, but it's now a world-famous photo, and today's the 55th anniversary of that happening.
Well, it's funny, Mark. I should have known that and should have been prepared for you to mention it, but you're exactly right, and it's a big day in the history of the school, and a pretty memorable event. And actually, I was privileged to work with NFL Films, did a documentary on the fire and its aftermath, and I had they were wonderful to work with. And again, another example of what an archives is and what it can do is to make sure that we had all the newspaper accounts of that fire, all of the images besides.
Where's
the
the original picture?
The original picture, the negative is still held by the widow of the photographer, who was the father of a member of the class of 1966, James Van Fleet. His father, Robert S. Van Fleet, took the photograph, and the school owns the rights to the photograph, but it's so widely distributed that we really can't.
Yeah, it showed up on my Facebook page this morning as under the memory thing. Peter, we're out of time. I want to thank you for joining us today. We've been chatting with Peter Weis, the archivist at Northfield Mount Hermon School, and he's got all kinds of advice. If you miss part of this, you'll be able to find this program next, or it should be now, on Westfield WSKB Community Radio's YouTube page. Don't forget to join us next Wednesday for another program on the Mark. And since this program will initially air the day before Thanksgiving, wanted to leave you with a song from Irving Berlin's Holiday Inn. It's the song Plenty to Be Thankful For. Thanks for joining us. Have a great holiday.
Thanks, Mark.
You girls. I've got eyes to see with.
Thanks to Optrix, the eye lotion made with science.
Ears to hear with.
Thanks to Benzel, the nasal spray made with amphetamines.
Arms to hug with, lips to kiss with.